Hi people, if you're new to this channel, welcome, and if you like my content, please consider subscribing. Feel free to share my content. So this one's a little bit different for me. It's not really the usual sort of thing I talk about, but I thought, why not? Not sure what particularly prompted me to it. I'm sure there was something I was watching the other night, but I don't remember off the top of my head. So I want to talk about my generation, which is millennials. I'm a millennial, and honestly, I'm very happy saying so. It's not something that I feel like, oh, I don't want to be associated with this generation. I'm very happy with it. Actually, statistically speaking, in the United States at least, the millennials are the biggest demographic group after baby boomers, or I think numerically they're about on par with baby boomers in terms of like how many people represent this generation. Although of course this changes over time. You know, in the coming years, maybe Generation Z for my American viewers will surpass that. So what do we mean by the millennial generation? Well, there's no exact science on this, there's no exact definition, but broadly speaking, it is anyone born between 1983 and 1998. You know, some would say 1982 to 1999, or 1984 to 1999, or 1984 to 2001. So there's not an exact definition of this, but broadly speaking, early 80s to late 90s, if you were born in that time, your class as a millennial. This basically means sociologists would say it's people whose formative years were leading up to the millennium, i.e., when you became a teenager, it was leading up to the millennium, or as a teenager, it was into the millennium. Um, the thing about the concept of growing up, in a sense, we're always growing up. Now, it will be my 40th birthday in less than a month. I was born on the 1st of September 1985, which happened, I always like to throw this in, it happened to be the very day that the Titanic was discovered on the bottom of the Atlantic. And I was born in Belfast, which is the city that it was built in, so that's kind of a connection that I've got. But yeah, I will be approaching my 40th year at the end of this month, and obviously it's very mixed feelings. I try not to overdo birthdays. I try not to, because you could be disappointed if you try to plan too much. This is a big one though, so I will be reflective. Um, 40 years old, it's something, you know. But I genuinely feel that people are living longer today. So to me, I honestly don't feel that old. I don't feel it's like, well, 40. It's a point in my life, you know, where decisions matter, where they really do. And I don't want to get too much into personal stuff, but there are some big decisions in my life that I have to reflect on around this time. So I do feel some pressure. That's the side to it that is just part of that. But that is arguably true of every big birthday. But I also feel that we shouldn't put too much pressure on ourselves just because it's a particular year. That's silly. What I want to talk about in this video is how much I associate or not with my generation as I see it. Firstly, I don't think that people have to be tied to their own generation. It's not like just because you're a certain age, you have to have certain interests or behave in a certain way. Because the stereotypes about each generation are just that. They don't represent everyone. Millennials often do get typecast in a particular way. I think some of the things that come to mind is that we're very much engulfed in the culture wars. I think that's something my generation has been a defining part of the millennial generation, that we have been in the culture wars. That is to say, you know, the political discourse has come about not necessarily from traditional left-right politics, but from uh, terminology and things that are thrown around. You know, that's too woke, or that's too right wing. We've seen some pretty important geopolitical events. You know, in the UK, Brexit; in the United States, the rise of Trump, and earlier the election of Obama. These are transformative events. Now, I don't particularly like the channel. It's a bit too left wing for my taste, but I think it was BuzzFeed. Yeah, BuzzFeed. They did have a very good video a few years ago on the generations, which was sort of exemplifying, laying out how each generation was defined. So, for example, baby boomers, people born immediately after World War II, um, were defined by the civil rights movement, by the moon landing, by those sort of issues. The Kennedy brothers, Watergate, those sort of big pivotal events in American social history. Um, Generation X tends to be a smaller generation wedged between baby boomers and millennials. So people who were kind of born in the late 60s, 1970s, and they kind of came of age at the end of the Cold War and throughout the 1990s. They're sometimes called the MTV generation. So those are people who kind of grew up in the 90s. Now, an interesting thing with this, with older millennials like myself, I think we have some connections to Generation X. What I mean by that is culturally, what is Generation X is people who remember a time just before the internet, or as the internet was growing perhaps, but before social media. Like I say, the MTV generation, well, I grew up as a big fan of the X Files. Now, the X Files would be something that people who grew up with Generation X perhaps remember more. Um, Indeed, most X Files episodes are rated a 15 or 12 certificate, so probably a little bit old for the age that I was. I think one characteristic of generations actually is to have a little bit of an affinity for the generation immediately preceding it. And what I mean by this is, take, for example, Friends. Friends was immensely popular as a show, but the Friends cast were all either younger baby boomers or older Generation X, I think it's fair to say. The cast are all now in their 50s, early 60s. So they would be Generation X. And yet my generation, a lot of millennials love Friends. We grew up with it. Another show that was very popular, The Big Bang Theory, where the cast were a little bit younger, a little bit more of our sort of age group. I think it's fair to say they're millennials themselves. They're a few years older than myself. They would be in their mid-40s now. So I'm just mentioning this because very often with generations we think of popular culture. But it's not strictly defined. I can watch a movie from the 70s and appreciate it. I can watch something from even the 40s and appreciate it. And although it is far back, I wouldn't necessarily connect with that generation. It's not like I can watch it. I can still appreciate it. I can watch an old movie and see the merit in that. Some are dated, some are not. I mean, some contemporary things are pretty forgettable. So the point I'm making with this is I don't think we necessarily have to be tied with our generation. Just because you're a certain age doesn't mean you have to particularly like the movies or the culture of that particular period. I mean, I would say music. There aren't that many modern musicians or contemporary musicians that I'm really into. I honestly find a lot of it sounds quite similar and to me just doesn't stand out. There are a few exceptions. I do like Lana Del Rey. I like her kind of retro style. I just think she's quite unique. But I'm not a super fan of any musician. I wouldn't go absolute. I mean, I wouldn't pay a lot of money to see any musician. If Lana Del Rey was performing at the Stadium of Light in Sunderland, I wouldn't necessarily go to see her. I like her music, but I'm not like a crazy that sort of level of fandom. But some people do, and fair play to them. But amongst modern musicians like Karl Steller, who's sort of an electro type Austrian, I would say it's actually more a group than an individual. Head Candy, I quite like the Head Candy record label. I like their Winter Chill stuff. I'm sure there's other stuff that can come to mind, but nothing that I'm super crazy about. So when it comes to music, I appreciate musicians from the past. I do like Elvis Presley. I like Billy Joel. I've got CDs ranging from Simon and Garfunkel to, frankly, a lot of stuff that would be more associated with baby boomers. I like ABBA. I like, who else? Leonard Cohen. That would be stuff that more baby boomers grew up with because I think there was genuinely a lot of talent at the time. Of course, there's talent today, but I mean, put it this way: I just could not get into a Cardi B video or a Drake video. I just couldn't. Maybe it's because I just don't like the rap genre, but that is very dominant in the music industry today. Pop, someone like Ed Sheeran, I think the guy is talented, but I'm not really moved either way. I'm not like I certainly wouldn't go out of my way to buy one of his albums. So contemporary music just doesn't have a big impact on me so much. But this is not to generalize because One thing I would point out also about generations is you cannot dismiss an entire generation as being good or bad in the sense of the quality output that there is. I mean, despite what people say, I do think, for example, there is quality out there. I think there's some very good movies. There is good art out there. Um, would I say the 2020s is a golden age of cinema? Not necessarily. For me, I think of the 1990s and the 1970s. But nevertheless, you still get some pretty good movies. I've just watched a Formula One movie with Brad Pitt. That's a damn good movie. So I'm just pointing this out because when we think of generations, it's not just geopolitics and social ideas and conventions, it's also popular culture. I suppose one thing that could be said of the 21st century, thinking particularly of the 2000s to 2010s and the 2020s, um, in a way, it's kind of a conflagration of all the other cultures and generations brought together. I mean, if we were to point out what is the fashion today, I think actually you would find it's a whole mixture of previous decades. Or what sort of cars do people drive in 2025? These are things that you can't immediately think of. I mean, put it this way: if you think of, say, the 1950s versus the 1980s, those are two quite distinctive decades. They're very easy to distinguish. But if you look at the 2000s versus the 2020s, I don't think the difference is that big. There's minor differences, but they're not massive. So in a way, the 21st century hasn't been as radical as many would have thought. Perhaps the Great Recession slowed things down. But what I mean by this is, if you take, for example, the fashion and the tastes and so on of the 2000s, I don't think they're radically different from the 2020s. There will be some differences, but I don't think it's as different as, say, the 1990s were to the 1970s or the 1980s to the 1950s. So in the 20th century, I think change was almost faster paced, ironically. This isn't to say there aren't big things happening today. The rise of social media has been a huge thing. My generation, it's the last generation that remembers a time before social media, and that's a significant thing. 2004 Facebook came about, 2005 YouTube, and then other sites like MySpace and so on were all about that time as well. We think of major geopolitical events like September 11th. That's now, it seems like a long time ago. And this is a crazy thing. When the news of 9/11 was happening, it was still more or less on conventional news. It was on TV broadcast newspapers. Imagine if that happened today, how that would take off in social media. It's interesting to think in 2001, social media didn't exist. That's, I mean, you could argue the 21st century really began in 2004. I suppose you could say, like, the Titanic marked the beginning of the 20th century in a sense, although it was 12 years into that century. Does that make sense? So, with a century, you get a big geopolitical event that kind of marks the beginning of a socio-political period of time. Um, so, this gets me to the question: how do I fit into my generation? Well, I'm a typical millennial in the sense I do spend a lot of time on social media. I obviously have this active channel. I spend a lot of time on Facebook. I have an Instagram account. In that sense, I'm a typical millennial. One big thing I would say I stand out from my generation is I have never really had a proper smartphone. Shock horror. This is my phone. This little thing. It's a basic phone. It's slightly above like the sort of phones you would have had in the early 2000s, but it's pretty much basic. I can make phone calls, text messages, there's an alarm clock, I can take pictures, and that's pretty much it. I can barely get the internet on it. It's a small storage space. Um, and yeah, it's a very basic phone. In fact, I'm having problems right now. You can see it's wedging out a little bit. The battery's expanding. I'm going to have to get a new phone when I can afford it. So, why have I never got a smartphone? Why do I not have the latest Galaxy model or the latest Apple or whatever it is? So many people in my generation just are adept to smartphones. They spend all the time on the smartphones, and I absolutely recognise that there's merit in that. I guess for me, it's two reasons. Firstly, cost. I have struggled financially. Smartphones are not cheap. That's one factor. Secondly, I've always done pay as you go. So I've always been, because I haven't had stable work, I don't want to be in a contract where I'm having to pay every month. And the third reason, I think it's a little bit of a stubborn rebellion on my part, where I feel that so much smartphones would be used as a fashion accessory as opposed to a practical tool for phone calls and text messages. And I guess I resent it a little bit because I feel like, why should I get a smartphone just to fit in? Why should I do that just to because everyone else has one? I guess a slight resentment on my part. Like, why should I spend a lot of money for that reason? If I was getting one, it would be for practical reasons. I mean, most of my internet browsing, in fact, all of it, is on my laptop. I spend a lot more time on my laptop than my phone. And that is an area where I do differ from other millennials. When I was working in China, I was in Shanghai, and a young guy actually came up to me on the Shanghai subway and asked why I had a small phone. And aside from being quite rude, that's the thing. I don't even think he realized he was being rude. Saying that to a stranger, basically saying, "Why is your phone so small?" Some of my students asked that as well, and I mean, I know that sometimes there's practical reasons for this, but for me, it's just a little bit of resentment or resentment's maybe a strong word, but rejection, because I think so much of smartphone usage is just following a trend. I mean, when people are paying more for a smartphone than they are for a second-hand car, that to me is incredible. I would like a better phone. I would like a decent smartphone, and I would like to get into it. I'd like to be used to it. If I'm being absolutely honest, I'm not a technophobe, but I do have a slight, I guess, discomfort with going into a mobile phone shop because I think very often they don't really want to help. They just want to sell you something. That's my experience. Um, or they'll just say, "Oh, this model's cheap. Get this one," which is, they always want to sell, sell, sell. So, in my experience, I don't find them particularly helpful. So that makes me a little bit. I've also had a few experiences when I was in China. There was another teacher who very publicly patronized me, and I did quite resent it because she was 15 years younger than me. She was in her early 20s at the time, and, well, 10 years younger. And she actually said she was an American. Dude, are you really? I won't do the accent, but is that really your phone? And I was saying, yeah, it's my phone. That's what I'm working with. And it just was uncalled for. It was just kind of condescending. And um, she probably didn't even realize she was doing it. It was just like this. So I think it's this forced convention I have a problem with. And I feel the same way about technology, whereby I'm a little bit wary of the advance of technology to the point where it's breakneck speed. And, if you don't fit in, you're a Luddite. I mean, I use DVDs to watch movies. I don't stream things. I like feeling of a DVD. And even that at the time was an update from, VCRs. I actually still have a VCR. And believe it or not, it still works. Show you. So, DVDs, Blu-rays, I just resent the idea that people have to adapt for the sake of convention rather than absolute necessity. I can understand a situation where something physically just isn't working anymore, so it has to be updated. But I do kind of reject the idea of forced convention. And I don't even think I am that much of a technophobe. I use technology extensively. I use social media extensively. But when it comes to smartphones, I just feel there's a little bit of a forced conformity, and I don't like it. Um, but nevertheless, I would like a better phone. This thing is not always reliable. It's a basic phone. I've trained in journalism. Now, if I ever make a breakthrough with that, I've been focusing on other things, but if I ever make a breakthrough with that, clearly a journalist needs a proper working phone. So things like that I'm very aware of. But I just feel there's a bit of a pressurized convention. Anyway, that is an area where I am not like other millennials. I don't use a smartphone. I'm not glued to a smartphone. In terms of the culture wars, I'm centre ground. I'm centrist. I do strongly reject woke thinking, and sometimes millennials are dismissed as snowflakes as woke. Actually, a lot of millennials don't like woke thinking. There's actually quite a lot of young conservatives around. I knew a guy who was a younger millennial, and he was pretty right wing, big fan of Trump, for example. and we had a bit of a falling out. That's a whole other story. But it's a bit of a misconception that young people are all left wing. That's not necessarily the case. I would consider myself an older millennial as opposed to someone born in the late 90s. And I'm part of a generation, older millennials. We still remember a time before social media. I mean, 2004, I was at university. I was 19 at the time. I pretty much had my teen years. I remember a German guy was explaining to me what YouTube was. It was all new and exciting back then. Now we take it all for granted. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. I reject the view that you could just stereotype one generation as all one thing. I mean, one thing is my generation. Is people often say we're entitled, we're too sensitive. Well, I can cite many millennials who do brave, selfless things. Um, I mean, I'm thinking of young British volunteers who've went to fight in Ukraine. That has some echoes of those volunteers who went to fight in the Spanish Civil War in the 30s. And although the climate thing can go too far, although eco-zealotry can definitely go too far, I think it's a contradiction to say young people don't care, and then when they do care, they're criticised. So, that's clearly not the case. But like I say, that can go too far as well. I'll wrap this up, but that's how I see myself. I'm proud to be a millennial. I'm not ashamed of it. We're a big generation. We're a generation that's seen some very important geopolitical events. Um, and I'd rather be a millennial than part of Generation Z because I think growing up in a generation where there's only social media, I mean, I look at my niece and nephews, in fact, they would be Generation Alpha, and they're good kids. I'm close to them, but I do feel a little concerned sometimes that they're absolutely glued to the screen and, are they getting out there? Are they experiencing the world beyond technology? It's a little bit, I am wary of overt reliance on technology. That's for another video. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. I suspect most of my subscribers, I know, in fact, by the data, a lot of you are in your 20s, so you'd be younger millennials or maybe even Generation Z. Um, some of you might be older, some of you might be Generation X or even baby boomers. But let me know, do you feel that you associate with the generation that you're part of? If you're a fellow millennial, how do you feel about it? Like I said, I'm proud to be a millennial, but I don't think it's easily defined as this is exactly the way a millennial thinks or what a millennial does. And like I say, I'm a millennial that doesn't regularly use a smartphone, so that's where I stand out. But I do regularly use social media, which is something that's associated with our generation. Then you get into the whole thing about, social status. I mean, I'm not married. I'm still single. Not single. But I'm not married. So there's that whole factor again. How how people like the BuzzFeed video, if I can find it, I'll put a link. Gets into how the recession affected people, like when they marry, when they become homeowners, all that sort of thing. I do think the Great Recession slowed down my generation badly. Um, right, I'll leave it there. If you're a millennial, how do you feel? Do you feel connected with this generation or not?